Okay, so let me ask you something. Where does opera come from? Or, those classic character types you see in sitcoms all the time. What about the actual shape of the stage in your local theater? It sounds crazy, but the answer to all of that really points back to one specific time and place, Renaissance Italy. So let's pull back the curtain and see how they basically built the foundations for the theater we still know and love today.
In this explainer, we're going to walk through the 6 big pillars of modern theater that were put up during this period. We'll kick things off with the huge cultural shift that made it all possible, then check out the new kinds of shows people were creating. We'll meet the pro comedians who took Europe by storm, see how the stage itself got a total makeover, understand the new rulebook for writing plays, and finally, trace this incredible legacy all the way to the present day.
All right, first things first, none of this could have happened without the Renaissance itself. The name literally means rebirth, and it was this amazing, explosive time of discovery, art, and a new focus on humanity. It really was the perfect storm for a theatrical revolution.
At the heart of this rebirth was this massive change in philosophy. See, in the Middle Ages, the focus was almost entirely on God and the afterlife, and people were seen as pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But the Renaissance, it completely flipped that script. All of a sudden, the spotlight swung over to human potential, what individuals could achieve, and the exciting world right here on Earth. This change in thinking right here is the engine for everything else we're going to talk about.
And this new mindset got supercharged by a few key things. When they rediscovered ancient Roman texts on architecture, it gave artists a whole new blueprint to work from. Then, the printing press came along and spread all these ideas old and new like wildfire. And get this, by 1637, theater wasn't just for the wealthy anymore. The very first public opera house opened its doors in Venice. That was a huge, huge deal. So with this new way of looking at the world, what were people actually watching on stage? Well, you had playwrights writing new tragedies and comedies based on the classics, but the stuff that was really popular, the stuff that was really influential, were things like pastorals, think romances about shepherds, and these big, flashy spectacles called intermezzi that they'd stage between the acts of other plays. But the biggest innovation of them all was the birth of a completely new art form. And that art form was opera. What's so fascinating is that it was kind of created by accident. There was this group of artists in Florence, and they were trying their best to perfectly recreate ancient Greek tragedies. They had this theory that the originals were sung or chanted, not just spoken. Well, their attempts to copy the past ended up creating something totally new and powerful, a drama told entirely through music. And honestly, of all the forms that came out of the Italian Renaissance, opera is the one that has truly stuck around. Now, while opera was being developed in these fancy courts and academies, a totally different kind of theater was just exploding in the streets and town squares. This was raw, it was chaotic, it was for the people, and it was performed by professionals. It was called Commedia dell'arte.
The name itself, Commedia dell'arte, literally translates to comedy of the professional players. And that was the key. These weren't nobles doing it for a hobby. These were full-time professional actors. This was their job. They traveled around in troupes, making a living doing what they loved.
And their style was unlike anything else. They didn't have scripts. They just had a basic plot outline, and they'd improvise all the dialogue. Each actor would specialize in one single character, and they'd often play that same character for their entire career. They had this whole collection of memorized gags and physical comedy bits called lazzi that they could just drop into a scene whenever they wanted. Most of the characters wore masks, and, this was a big deal, these troupes included women as performers, and everyone shared in the profits.
So these stock characters, you could pretty much break them down into 3 groups. First, you had the masked masters. These were the greedy old men, the know-it-all professors, the bragging soldiers. Then you had the masked servants, or the zanni, who were the clever acrobatic clowns who really drove the plot. And finally, you had the unmasked young lovers, the inamorati. They were handsome, witty, and, well, in love, and they were usually the reason for all the chaos. Let's meet a few of the biggest names.
First up, we've got Pantalone. He's this cheap, old merchant from Venice who's totally obsessed with his money and always trying to meddle in his kids' love lives to make a quick buck. Think of characters like Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob, or maybe Frank Reynolds from It's Always Sunny. That grumpy, greedy father figure archetype? Yep, its DNA goes right back to Pantalone.
Next is his buddy, Dottore, the doctor. This guy is a total fraud. He pretends to be this brilliant academic, always spouting what sounds like Latin but is actually just gibberish and stating facts that he just made up on the spot.
He is the original pompous intellectual who is, secretly, a complete idiot.
And finally, we have the real star of the show, Harlequin, or Arlecchino. He was by far the most popular of the servants. The guy was an amazing acrobat, a really clever trickster, and he was always hungry. He's the one at the heart of all the schemes and mix-ups that make the plots so fun. He is, without a doubt, the granddaddy of all the clever sidekicks and trickster heroes we still love today.
Okay, so while the plays and the actors were going through this huge evolution, the physical space they performed in was changing too. The Italian Renaissance didn't just invent new characters, it completely reinvented the theater itself, creating the blueprint for the stages we still use.
You can really see this change by looking at two specific theaters. First, there's the Teatro Olimpico. It was this absolutely gorgeous attempt to build a classic Roman theater inside a building, complete with these permanent, super detailed street scenes. It's stunning, but it was a dead end. The real future was the Teatro Farnese. Why? Because it had the first permanent proscenium arch. You know, that picture frame that separates us, the audience, from the world of the play? That simple arch became the standard design for nearly every theater for the next 300 years.
And behind that arch, designers got obsessed with creating realism. They started using perspective drawing, a pretty new technique in painting back then, to make flat painted scenery look like it had real depth. One designer, Sebastiano Serlio, even said you only needed 3 basic sets: a grand street for tragedies, a common street for comedies, and a countryside scene for pastorals. To make the illusion even better, they'd often build the stage on an angle, sloping upwards, which we now call a rake stage.
So how did they change these big painted sets? The answer was a brilliant piece of engineering called the pole and chariot system. Okay, here's how it worked. The painted flats were attached to big poles. These poles went down through slots in the stage floor. Underneath the stage, the poles were hooked up to these little wagons, or chariots, that ran on tracks. All the chariots were connected by ropes to a single giant winch. This meant one stagehand could turn a crank and, like magic, the entire scene would smoothly slide out of sight as a new one slid into place. It was a total game changer for stagecraft.
So, with all this wild, creative energy flying around, you just knew a counter-movement was bound to happen, right? Critics started looking back at the works of ancient thinkers like Aristotle, and they decided it was time to bring some order to the chaos. They basically created a brand new, very strict rulebook for what they thought made a perfect play. They called these the neoclassical ideals, and the whole point was to make plays follow 2 main principles. The first was verisimilitude, which is just a fancy way of saying the play had to seem true to life. So no ghosts, no magic, none of that stuff. The second was decorum, which meant characters had to act in a way that was appropriate for their social status, their gender, and their age. And most importantly, every play had to teach the audience a good moral lesson. Now, these ideals led to some super restrictive rules, and the most famous are the 3 unities. First, the unity of time. The entire story had to happen within a 24-hour window. Second, the unity of place. It all had to take place in a single location. And third, the unity of action. There could only be one main plot, with no subplots to distract you. And the reasoning for all this? They just didn't think an audience's imagination could handle anything more complex, and still believe it was real. These rules would go on to have a huge influence on playwrights for centuries. So when you put all these pieces together, what's the big takeaway? Well, these incredible innovations that came out of Renaissance Italy didn't just stay there. They spread like wildfire across the entire continent, and they literally set the stage for the next chapter of European theater.
The bottom line is this. By the middle of the 1600s, all the key ingredients were on the table. Opera, the professional actors of Commedia dell'arte, the proscenium stage with its amazing scenery, and those strict neoclassical rules. These Italian inventions became the standard, the absolute bedrock of theater all across Europe for the next century and a half.
And that legacy is absolutely still with us. So I'll leave you with a question to chew on. When you look at the entertainment you love today, from the characters in your favorite comedy to the shape of the screen at the movie theater, which of these Renaissance innovations do you see the most? Once you start looking, you'll see it everywhere.